Good evening. Hi. First of all, thank you very much for coming tonight, this evening. I realize it's a working day, and also there was plenty of rain, and despite that you're here, and ash clouds. Despite ash clouds, our honored guest is here. That's fantastic. First of all, I would like to thank Soas for providing this venue for us. It's an honor to have Dr. Aslan with us, and he will get to talk about his latest book a little bit later on. But before doing that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our activities. We like to do obviously both cultural, educational, and charity activities. Every event we organize, we would like to link up with a charity. And this evening is the MS Society, and MS is a neurological disease. It's a terrible disease. It's spreading around the globe, especially in the Middle East and in Iran. And there are representatives from MS Society here. If later on you would like to have a dialogue with that, I would encourage you to do that, because they need your support. They need that exchange of ideas, especially in Iran. This disease, unfortunately, is spreading very fast. And MS Society, although it's a UK-based organization, it has extensive links with the Middle East and especially Iran. Okay, that's the charity part done. I also would like to, first of all, introduce Tata Shafi Monfared, and I'll ask her in a minute to come up here and tell you a little bit about the kind of activities she's doing. She's full of energy. We have done a number of events together, a number of activities, again, on cultural matters, charity and educational, both in Iran, in Dubai, and in the US. And I'm so glad that she's come here, and she hopefully will tell you a little bit about the kind of activities she's doing across the pond. Our idea is, of course, we've used Dr. Aslan as a catalyst to bring Tata here and to bring you here. The idea is to create a network amongst like-minded people, and of course create a network where you can exchange ideas, thoughts, and activities. So without further ado, Tata, would you like to come up and say a few words?
Ladies and gentlemen, respected directors of the School of Oriental and African Studies and the London Middle East Institute, distinguished guests, honorable professors, and the speaker of the night, Dr. Aslan, welcome and good evening. I'm Tahir Monfared. I'm here from Sacramento, California, but I'm originally from Iran. I'm a wife and a mother of 4 wonderful kids. And if I may name myself, a cultural advocate and a publisher of a young magazine, Senses, focused on art and culture. We are here tonight as a result of affiliation with London Middle East Institute and the wonderful support of our colleagues at London Cultural Signature. On behalf of Senses magazine and our affiliates, I'd like to extend my gratitude to these organizations. We are thrilled to be part of the effort to recognize, support, and promote the value of Iran and Middle Eastern culture through this engagement with Soas and the London Middle East Institute. Senses magazine is preparing to relaunch with a new focus that gives special attention to professional women of Middle East origin. In keeping with this concept, we are also developing a series of cultural activities around the world to bring attention to the cultural accomplishment of Middle Eastern origins. We are convinced that such cultural exchange is vital to promote peace and understanding for generations to come. We believe that through education, we can contribute to diminishing and someday eliminating discrimination and prejudice around the world. In pursuit of our theme of seeking a healthier and more peaceful environment, we are eager to explore possibilities for collaboration with communities and institutions that support a peaceful and professional dialogue among people and provide opportunities to bring the world together. Tonight, as our first such international collaboration, we are proud to bring you the inspiring speaker, writer, and scholar, Dr. Reza Aslan. This is the second time I have the honor of hosting Dr. Aslan. We last had the privilege of hosting him at the University of California in Davis when he generously made a presentation to support a new program in Middle East and Southeast Asia studies named MESA. The event for MESA not only brought a substantial sum in ticket sales, but gave the program credibility that helped it earn a grant from well-known Iranian foundation and enabled the department to establish Iranian studies as an academic minor. Dr. Aslan's recent book, Tablet and Pen, brings a collection of classic and modern examples of the best Middle Eastern writing to the English-speaking world, many translated for the first time. The Los Angeles Times stated, "This is the triumph of tablet and pen to connect us at the level of our humanity, no matter we may be from." Dr. Aslan, we are honored to have you here, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy a great talk tonight. But before we begin, I invite Mr. Lakhani later on from Cultural Signature to make a more thorough introduction of Dr. Aslan. Ramin and his fabulous team in Cultural Signature include Bahar Lakhani and Shukufe Abdi, have been very keen in supporting of our cultural activities many times and in many places in the past, as they are again tonight. I am so lucky and pleased to benefit from their support as always. In fact, Ramin and Bahar traveled all the way to California last year to support our UC Davis event. Ramin also joined me in Dubai to support MESA. There, Ramin's exceptional ability in initiating this challenging program and his business influence, not to mention his charming personality, helped to attract thousands of dollars in donation to MESA to establish the Arab Studies program. Ramin Jan, please join me welcoming Dr. Aslan. Thank you.
Tata, thank you very much for those wonderful words. I appreciate that. It was my pleasure to work with you, and we shall do that many times. Okay, so Dr. Aslan, when we were talking about a potential program, we were wondering, what's the next program, and then Tata came up with the idea, and then, of course, we have seen his speeches before, and I'm sure some of you have, some of you haven't. I can assure you it's wonderful to see him speak, and also his book. I'm sure you've heard about the wonderful book of No God But God. It was a bestseller. I enjoyed reading it. But really, it's not just a book. I think, hopefully you will have an opportunity to mingle with Dr. Aslan. He's here later on to sign his books and have a one-on-one discussions, if possible. But also there's going to be a Q&A, question and answer session after his speech, where you hopefully have an opportunity to have a dialogue. And some of the answers he provides are really enlightening. So I do encourage you to get engaged on that. But when we were talking about, what should be the event, and then we started engaging with Dr. Aslan, some of the things that really differentiates him, and we really use that as kind of the key reasons, the three key reasons for me. One of that, I feel that there's a very deep understanding. It's not superficial. There's a deep understanding of Middle Eastern, the regional cultures, literature, etc. Second thing is, of course, his ability to communicate so well, very crisp logic. But most of all, the third part for me was that it's really passionate. You know, he's passionate about the subject. It's not that he's doing it because it's his job. I'm sure he's doing a great job, of course. But it really comes from the bottom of the heart. It comes with a lot of passion and energy. I really do hope that I'm sure tonight he will share some of that passionate feelings he has about the region, about culture, and what's happening. And of course, I think the timing is excellent for us because, as you have seen, there's been talk about the Arab Spring. Of course, there's been events in other parts, in Iran and other parts of the region, which has explained to people, look, this is not the homogeneous situation in the region, but of course, trying to understand each country and the cultural differences. I think literature will be a significant part in explaining the differences and the importance of some of the events that are happening right now, and I'm sure Dr. Aslan will expand on that. Now, he doesn't need a detailed introduction, but of course, I wanted to highlight, of course, his educational pedigree. He has degrees in religions from Santa Clara University, also from Harvard University and the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Iowa. He teaches extensively. He gives many speeches, and of course, his book tonight will be the key part of his speech. Now, that is Dr. Aslan as far as I could explain him, but of course, I'm sure you'll find out more when he starts his talk. So please, Dr. Aslan, could you start your speech?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Tata. Thank you, everyone. It really is. I have to say, in my opinion, Soas is by far the best school in Europe for the study of this region. And so it's quite an honor for me to be able to stand before you, some students, faculty, and the wider community. And so for that reason, what I'd like to do is keep my comments fairly brief. Will this stand? Look at that. I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief because the thing that I like about these kinds of events is the opportunity to engage you in conversation, and I'm sure that there's a lot to be said about this topic and this region. The topic being, of course, the power of the word. One of the things that I think has been lost in the discussions about the so-called Arab Spring, indeed, the overwhelming democratic demonstrations that we've seen across North Africa and in the Middle East, is the role that poetry, that literature has played in these protests, in these demonstrations. Think back to the events in Tunisia that for some people started the so-called Arab Spring. And one of the things that we forget is that those young people, those thousands of young people who were on the streets demanding their most basic dignity, the most basic rights, the right of dignity, were actually using verses of poetry from the great Tunisian national poet Abul Qassam al-Shabi, and that had used that poetry, that had transformed those verses into political chants. Some of you may recall Abul Qassam al-Shabi's most famous poem, To the Tyrants of the World. This is that poem that became, in many ways, the rallying cry for the people of Tunisia. Poem whose famous verse says, "Oppressive tyrants, lover of darkness, enemy of life, you have ridiculed the size of the weak people. Your palm is soaked with their blood." This idea of verse as a rallying cry, not only to create unity amongst the population, but to use the power of those words to bring down a government, to actually reshape society, is something that was used not just in Tunisia, but certainly in Egypt during those great sort of weeks and months in which we had the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians from all walks of life appearing in Tahrir Square. They too were using poetry. They too were using the power of the word to define themselves, to unite themselves, and to bring down the despot in that country. In this case, it wasn't the Tunisian poet Ashabi, it was actually a septuagenarian poet, the great Ahmed Fuad al-Nigam, who's still alive actually, but whose poetry was written in the years of Nasser and the aftermath of the Free Officers' Revolt, as Egypt descended into a military dictatorship that lasted some 60 years until just a month ago. Many years ago, Al-Nigam, who, like Tunisia's great poet Ashabi, spent time in jail, and in Nigam's part, he actually spent a good 5 years in prison for his writings. This is a man who began his life as a fellah, who's a laborer in a mechanic's shop, and was just basically writing these poetical expressions of what most Egyptians like him were feeling at the time. His poem, I Am the People, became a rallying cry for the freedom movement in Egypt. I'll read a little bit from this poem if you don't mind. This is I Am the People by Ahmed Fuad al-Nigam. I am the people marching, and I know my way. My struggle is my weapon, my determination, my friend. I fight the nights, and with my hope's eyes, I determine where true morning lies. I am the people marching, and I know my way. I am the people, my hand lights life, makes deserts green, devastates tyrants, raising truths, banners on guns. My history becomes my lighthouse and comrade. I am the people marching, and I know my way. No matter how many prisons they build, no matter how much their dogs try to betray, my day will break and my fire will destroy seas of dogs and prisons out of my way. I am the people, and the sun is a rose in my sleeve, the day's fire, horses galloping in my blood. My children will defeat every oppressor. Who can stand in my way? I am the people marching, and I know my way. And it's remarkable to think that indeed his children did stand up against the oppressor. They did bring down the tyrant. The power of the word in this region, of course, is nothing new. Indeed, one can talk about the very history of Islam as being founded precisely on this issue of the word as a talisman of power. Now, most of you know, of course, this goes back to pre-Islamic times. The Bedouins who populated both the sedentary populations and the nomadic populations who populated pre-Islamic Arabia understood very clearly that words, and poetry in particular, is more than just a way of communicating thoughts, a way of communicating to one another. It's actually a tool. It is indeed a weapon. In fact, oftentimes, wars between tribes would begin, first of all, with one poet from each tribe facing off in verse. Verses were, in fact, used as a way of defeating the enemy. You didn't have to fight a war if your poets could fight each other with words. Words themselves, poetry, were seen as a way of communicating with the divine as well. It was a sign of manliness. In fact, during the pre-Islamic pilgrimages at the Kaaba, most of you know, of course, the Kaaba predates Islam by 200 years, if not more, and indeed was, before the time of the rise of the Prophet Muhammad, a kind of pantheon of the pre-Islamic gods. During the great festivals and celebration of those gods, there would be contest wherein poets would battle one another in sort of a deaf poetry jam sort of thing. And the winners would have their verses embroidered on expensive pieces of silk, and that silk would be hung from the Kaaba. And I don't think, by the way, that it's a coincidence that to this day there are still verses of poetry hung from the Kaaba, but those verses come from the poetry of the Quran. In fact, when I say that poetry was a way of communicating with the divine, I mean that quite literally. In pre-Islamic Arabia, of course, that communication was the purview of the kahin. The kahin were these sort of poet soothsayers. They were a priestly class, if there were such a thing in pre-Islamic Arabia, and there weren't. But the way to think of them is as a kind of priestly class. Indeed, the word kahin comes from the Hebrew word kohen, which describes a priestly class in Judaism. The kahin were sort of Delphic oracles, in a sense. They would go into these trances where, for a fee, of course, they had to make a living, for a fee, they would communicate with the gods, and they would, they would essentially enlighten the people about the will of the gods. If you had some question about whether it was a good time to go to war or where your lost camel is, you would ask a kahin. And that kahin would come out of his trance and then would reveal the secret message of God, the secret will of God through rhyming couplets. And those rhyming couplets were conceived of as the language of the gods. It is, again, not a coincidence that the first revelations that the Prophet Muhammad received during his early period in Mecca all came to him in rhyming couplets. Because it would have been inconceivable that the gods would have spoken in any other way except in poetry. Poetry was understood to be the height of human communication. And so therefore, it only made sense that whether you were talking about the many gods, whether you're talking about the Syrian god Hubal, or whether you're talking about the sky god Allah, whether you thought of him as many gods or one god, the divine could only speak in poetry. That is the power of the word that so infused pre-Islamic culture as well as Islamic culture itself. Many of you know, of course, that this is sort of the whole issue about the Quran. The Quran, of course, means the recitation, an indication to all of us that these were verses that were never meant to be either written down or read, which is why, indeed, during the Prophet's lifetime, they were never written down. Yes, it's true, certain of the later verses, those verses that had become far more prosaic for a very important reason, as you know, because one of the chief accusations that was thrown at the Prophet was that he was just merely a kahin, like the many kahins around him. Indeed, we know for a fact that this was a problem for the early Muslim community because of the numerous verses in the Quran that go out of their way to actually say that the Prophet is not a kahin, that the Prophet is not a poet, that this is something completely different. So obviously this was an accusation that the early Muslim community really felt could be quite damaging. The Quraysh are supposed to say, the Prophet's enemies were supposedly say, are we to listen to the ravings of a mad poet? The Prophet himself said quite clearly to Khadijah after that first experience of the revelation that if this means that I am a poet, by which he meant kahin, if this means that I am a kahin, then I would rather kill myself. And indeed, he wanted to kill himself, and were it not for his wife Khadijah, history would have turned out quite differently, perhaps. So this was a serious accusation for the Prophet Muhammad, and indeed, as I said, in the latter part of the revelation, particularly during the time in Medina when the first Muslim community was beginning to be formed, the verses stopped being poetical. They stopped coming and rhyming couplets, and they became much more prosaic as they began to deal with much more legal issues. What I was saying before was that it was those few verses, those dealing with issues of inheritance law, issues of divorce, those that had something to do with the actual legality of the formation of the early community, those were the only verses that were ever written during the Prophet's lifetime. They were written on bits of bone, bits of palm leaves. But for the most part, it seems very clear that, at least in the Prophet's mind, that the Quran, the recitation, was never meant to be written, was never meant to be read. On the contrary, it was meant to be spoken aloud. The words themselves carried this spiritual power, this idea that in Arabic, in Islamic studies, is known as barakah, spiritual power, the power of God. The physical words themselves, not the meaning behind the words. Those of you who study Judaic studies are quite familiar with this idea because it's very much the same notion. The Torah, like the Quran, is infused with divine power. The words themselves, the physical letters on the page, which is why all Muslims, like all Jews, have to be able to recite at least some part of the scripture in the original language. It is irrelevant whether you know what you're saying or not. That's unimportant. The meaning is unimportant. It's the words themselves that carry divine power, barakah. That's what they mean when they say infused with the divine. And indeed, to this day, as you all know, the science of Quranic recitation is seen as a form of worship. These grand concerts that one sees throughout the Middle East, the American Idol version of, or the X Factor version of, the Quranic recitations. These aren't seen as performance. There's a reason why the science of recitation has so many rules and regulations about when you can stop and when you can't stop, and how long you can take a breath for, and how long a vowel must be held for, and how long a consonant must be held for. These are very strict guidelines because it is meant to remind the reciter that what he or she is doing is not an act of personal will, but an actual devotion. This is for people who are unfamiliar with the Quran. This is kind of a hard thing to understand. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come up to me and say, I went to Barnes & Noble or Waterstone, and I bought a Quran because I wanted to understand it, and I got 3 verses into it, and I just couldn't read anymore. There's a reason for that, because the Quran is not meant to be read. It's meant to be recited. It's meant to be read it's not meant to be read on paper. It's meant to be read in community. That's why it's put together in the way that it is. It's a deliberate text put together with as little human editorial intrusion as possible. It's not put together thematically, as you know. It's not put together chronologically, as you know. Yes, there are chapter titles, but those chapter titles are utterly irrelevant, for the most part, to the subject of what you're about to read. They're put together from the longest surah to the shortest surah on purpose, without any kind of commentary, without any kind of attempt to put it into context, because it's meant to be the direct revelation from God. Tanzil is the term for this. The direct revelation from God. The Quran, in other words, to put it in more dramatic terms, is God's dramatic monologue. It is God speaking to humanity. And the reason that it's supposed to be spoken aloud is that when it is done so, when you are at these recitations, the speaking aloud of the Quran turns that monologue into a dialogue. The creator and the created in conversation with each other. That is the power of this word. It's for that reason, by the way, that the Quran, like the Torah, by the way, is used so often as a talisman. Verses of the Quran are put in lockets, they're put in little keepsakes, they're kept near the heart, they're kept in the pocket. Again, very much like tefillin. Verses of the Quran are etched on plates or on cups. If you go to the British Museum, you'll see this. These wonderful works of calligraphy etched into plates. Why? Because the point of it is that when you put food on that plate, when you consume the food, you are consuming the words of the Quran. When you line a cup with the verses of the Quran and you pour water into it and drink from it, you are consuming the Quran. The verses of the Quran are often etched onto lamps so that when you put a candle in it, the reflection of the Quran goes in a 360-degree radius, so that as you walk by, those verses touch you, and when they touch you, you are absorbing the power of the Quran. Barakah. That's what it means. That's where we get the art of calligraphy. There is this mistaken idea in the West that the rise of calligraphy in the Arab and Islamic worlds is due to the fact that, Islam eschews iconography. Not true. That is a false statement. First of all, it's a false statement that Islam eschews iconography. I mean, if you know anything about Islamic history, you know that it is replete with gorgeous, wonderful images of the Prophet Muhammad throughout the centuries. This idea, this bruja, this utter nonsense that we have heard since the so-called Muhammad cartoon controversies, that the very act of depicting the Prophet is a sin in Islam, is nonsense. There is not a single school of law that calls that a sin. It's frowned upon. It's frowned upon. It goes against the tradition of Islam as an iconoclastic ideology, iconoclastic religion. But the reason that we have instead in Islam the rise of calligraphy as the supreme form of artistic expression is because the very act of calligraphy is not an art form. It is an act of devotion. It is an act of worship. Because in writing the words of the Quran, you are not communicating thoughts. You are actually absorbing the power of God. That is, by the way, why the Quran cannot be translated from Arabic. If you translate the Quran from Arabic, it's no longer the Quran. It's for this reason why when you go to a bookstore to buy a Quran in English, you will, without exception, see a version of the Quran, probably in the margins, in infinitesimally small writing,